Today in the EU, why the German election is still not over.
Wir haben diese Bundestagswahl 2025 gewonnen.
As European powers are losing their grip on the global stage, all eyes are now on Germany. Yesterday, 59 million voters cast their ballots in what is considered a defining election for Europe's future. But the hardest part is yet to come. Coalition building has just started, although one thing is clear. Friedrich Merz guaranteed he would not ally with the AfD on election night.
Meine Partei hat das klar gesagt und die Wählerinnen und Wähler der Union und der AfD wussten vor der Wahl, dass es hier zu keiner Zusammenarbeit kommt.
Guten Morgen, I'm Jeremiah Lin, recording from Euractiv's Berlin office, and this is Today in the EU. Here's what we know so far. As predicted, it was a big night for the Christian Democrats, who led in the polls throughout the campaign. They came out on top with 29%, according to the latest projections. This is a good reason for them to celebrate, but maybe not too hard, because the biggest political move of this election was the far-right AfD doubling their score to 20%, making it now the second force in parliament. This is the party's biggest breakthrough in a federal election since it was founded in 2013. For the Social Democrats of Olaf Scholz, on the other hand, it was more of an existential crisis. They scored 16%, a 10-point fall from the last federal election in 2021, which means that for the first time since World War II, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats did not take the first two places in a national election. This election definitely marks a turning point for Germany's leadership. European capitals are bracing for Merz's promised new leading role in the EU. As European Parliament CDU and CSU delegation leader Daniel Caspary told Euractiv, Germany is back on track.
The largest country in the heart of Europe, which is Germany, is now back on track. Now we have to be the first one trying to bring together the interests of the 27 European member states.
So, what should we make of these results? What could Germany's next government look like? And what does Merz hold for the future of the EU? Yesterday, Euractiv's editor-in-chief, Matthew Karnitschnig, and German bureau chief, Nick Alipour, reacted to the results as they were coming in from our Berlin office.
So, Nick, it's 5 minutes to midnight, literally, for Germany. We've got the preliminary results, more or less. We know that the CDU has won. We know that the only real coalition option for sure at the moment is a three-way coalition with the SPD and the Greens. There's an outside possibility that Friedrich Merz will manage to build a coalition with just the Social Democrats if the far-left Sarah Wagenknecht alliance does not get into the parliament. But other than that, we're not really sure about what the result is going to be. What is your takeaway from this night, which seems to me to be a little bit underwhelming compared to what some of us were expecting? We thought that you could have had a much stronger result for the far right, for example, for the AfD. They came in at just 20%, really in line with what the polls were showing. What is your take?
So I think actually the later it got tonight, the more it starts to feel to me like a proper election of the 2020s, the 1920s. The closer we got to the certainty that it won't be a two-party coalition, that there won't be a two-party coalition possible in the center at all, and that we would have to probably see the CDU form a three-party coalition to make the center hold, the more it dawned on me, at least, that I think we've truly opened a new chapter in German politics. You know, in some ways, we always thought perhaps that the last election in 2021, we did have a fairly unstable three-party coalition on the center-left, that would perhaps remain an exception. There was at least maybe wishful thinking involved. But now that we're edging closer to the three-party coalition in 2025, there was a sense of, you know, the decadent 1920s feeling, especially since we're edging closer to the number 33 in a few years. And I know at least that Friedrich Merz has been quoted saying once 33 for Germany is enough. So there are those fears. There were those fears before the ballot today. And I feel like if tonight's shown one thing, it's probably that we might be closer to this sort of scenario than many had perhaps hoped.
Well, I'm not fearful. I hope you're not fearful. I don't want to paint the devil on the wall, as the Germans like to say. I know a lot of people like to talk about Weimar and how this could be another Weimar, but, you know, as they say, history doesn't repeat itself, though it does often rhyme. It seems to me, though, that Friedrich Merz is really playing for time here in the sense that if the AfD is already at 20% and you have the overall electorate really shifting to the right today, I think at the last election, the CDU, together with the AfD, so the sort of conservative bloc of German voters, totaled just under 35% of the electorate, and today's results suggest that it's closer to 50%. You really have to wonder how long this so-called firewall in Germany is going to hold, given that in all likelihood, and again, these results aren't definitive tonight, it looks like the CDU is going to have to go into a three-party coalition with the Greens and SPD, as we said. But that's going to be another awkward pairing for the CDU, for Merz in particular. And if you look back at the last 3 years, we had a very similar coalition. It's just that the fulcrum of that coalition was not the center-right, it was the center-left. The Social Democrats were the leading party there, but they had huge difficulties with the conservative partner in that coalition, the Free Democrats, and that ultimately led to the collapse of that coalition. The Free Democrats were kicked out of the Bundestag, of the parliament today. But it does seem like this firewall is not going to be something that's going to be around in a few years, or do you disagree?
No, I think that's precisely the question we should be asking, because I do think this time around it might just last, it might just hold, but for how much longer? And in fact, that's something I was discussing, obviously, with some colleagues today. Who will be the first people in the CDU to actually try and tear down that firewall? Might it be in the East, after all, where the AfD is already quite strong and people in the CDU are very worried that they might not be around much longer if they don't sort of make adjustments and take steps towards the AfD. That is a real possibility. And for me, again, we might not be fearful about it. We might be fearful about it. It does underline the situation we're in, which is that it's just no longer so easy to do politics in Germany without the AfD. In a way, if you listen to what Friedrich Merz has been advertising as his policies over the last few months, it is already really close to what the AfD has for a long time been championing at the national stage, to the extent that Alice Weidel today on television after the results were in said very clearly, actually pretty much just copying our entire election manifesto. It really wouldn't be a big deal to enter a coalition with them because we're already so close. We wouldn't have to make any concessions. She's not wrong, indeed. So the question is, even if the firewall holds for just this 4-year period, in some ways we're already past it because the AfD has taken over mainstream politics as it stands.
Where she is wrong and where the AfD is overall wrong, I think, is on the question of the transatlantic relationship and their stance towards Russia. The CDU, Friedrich Merz, is still very much a transatlanticist, although he signaled today that Germany and Europe might need to rethink the relationship with the United States, given everything that's come out of Washington over the past couple of weeks. But the problem with the AfD is that they are very friendly with Vladimir Putin. They're very friendly with the idea of distancing Germany and Europe from the United States and the transatlantic alliance, NATO. What do you think that would mean going forward, especially because by the looks of it, this new coalition in Germany is not going to have the supermajority it would need in the parliament in order to lift the debt brake, which would allow the government to take extraordinary steps in terms of defense spending. Some people might remember this is what happened in the last government under Scholz, the so-called Sondervermögen, which was a 100 billion euro fund that the government set up to modernize the German military, at least to begin modernizing it. And to do that, he needed the votes of the CDU in order to pass this through parliament. And it looks like Merz's new coalition is unlikely to have that same kind of a majority. So what do you think this will mean for Germany's security discussion here going forward?
I think this is, again, the seed perhaps of destruction for the next coalition, because if we can't find the money through, extra debt or some extra budgetary means, then that means most likely that we will have to take it from social spending. And if the coalition turns out as we think it does, which would be the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Greens, then at least the Social Democrats won't be happy about that at all. But at the same time, as you rightly pointed out, we're in a situation where it is difficult to ignore this at all. So everyone knows we have to spend more on our security. Friedrich Merz himself said one of his, well, if not his first priority, will be as a chancellor to get Europe to be independent from America's security protection. Some experts think that already at this point where we're just trying to, just keep sort of our defenses intact, we might need some 500 billion spent in Europe over 10 years, which is a very conservative estimate in my opinion, could now run up to a lot more. How are we going to fund that if the largest economy doesn't have any money to spend? Well, it will have to be cuts, or we won't spend on it at all, meaning there will be most likely some sort of, there will definitely be a fight over this in the next coalition. And if we're unlucky, we can see this coalition last as long as the last one, which is not the full 4 years that it was elected for.
That said, I think if the war in Ukraine continues, that could focus minds, especially if it looks like Putin is going to go after another country in the region. If he were to try to move into Estonia or something like that to test NATO's resolve, that should give people here religion in terms of spending more money on defense, which is what we saw in 2022 after the full-scale invasion of Russia, because before that, the SPD had also all but ruled out spending much more on defense. The real thing that I've been trying to figure out tonight, kind of looking at these results and seeing the reactions, is that nobody really seems to be that happy by their results. I mean, the CDU got just under 30%. They'd really been hoping to get over 30%. Merz is obviously happy because he's going to be chancellor, and he's been trying to get this job for the, last 4 decades, basically. But other than that, the Greens underperformed. The SPD recorded the worst result in its 160-some year history, as far as I know. Even the AfD came in line with the polls, but given everything that's happened in Germany over the past months and their war on migration and all of the terrorist attacks, there were a lot of people, myself included, who thought they were going to do much better than they did. But there were a few parties that did do better. And who do you think are the real kind of winners tonight, the surprise winners?
I tend to agree with you that there were no winners tonight in some sense, nobody who's perfectly happy. but there are people who are relieved, and I think that's good for this election, probably as good as it gets, and that's the left, obviously, who were already sort of presumed dead a few months ago, but who somehow rallied at the last few meters and made it past the 5% electoral threshold, so they actually represent in Parliament at a very decent figure of, I believe it was around 8% at this point, or slightly above, which they managed to do with apparently, people say at this point, a very clever social media campaign, perhaps also aided by the fact that many people were worried about the rise of the AfD, and the left was sort of the clearest opposite that there is to the AfD.
Well, they ran with a group of three sort of 60 to 80 something old leftist icons, really, right?
And yet in the end they didn't even need them, because they were going to take advantage of a special constitutional clause which would have allowed them to be represented in Parliament if they just win 3 constituencies with those old guys, but they made it past the threshold anyway. So, but in a way, again, this is something that underlines my point from earlier, that this election feels so very Weimery, and it might be the sleep deprivation speaking at this point, but there's a sense of unrest and concern indeed, just that we see, how much the extremes have grown. The AfD, even though they were only sort of at 20%, their end game is not 25, their end game is 29, according to themselves. And for the moment, they have an extra 10%, they nearly doubled, speaking for them. And the Linke also gained significantly. So the true sort of or the parties that were the most relieved, if you will, tonight, were the parties at the extremes. And everything in between shrunk. The sort of for a long time, the centrist party, I'd say, give or take, of Germany, the FDP, is now out of the parliament. They are no longer relevant. We're sort of approaching a scenario where the center is squeezed between two extremist blocs, not so different indeed than from France, Germany's neighbor. Another big question, sort of who's going to lead Europe after this election? Can Germany still lead Europe? Who will it lead Europe with? Is France going to be a good partner? Because he did, Friedrich Merz, when you listen to him today, he did sound very similar to Macron on some points, but do they still have enough power to do that? I don't know. I'd be curious to hear your opinion on that.
Well, you do have to wonder, given the state of the German economy, it's been stagnating for 5 years now. It's been in recession for 2 years, and now it looks like Germany's going to have a coalition of strange bedfellows, and Merz certainly is not going to have the kind of mandate he was hoping for to really restructure the German economy, to do things on the tax front, for example, to really galvanize the business community again. That looks like that's going to be difficult, which is why I also wonder what this really means for the rest of Europe. A lot of our readers and listeners are probably wondering, well, what will this mean for Germany's European path going forward? And I think it's too early to say. You've heard Merz come out and saying he wants to make Europe a priority again, but I don't see too many concrete plans on that front. And I think they're going to have to really sort out the transatlantic relationship to begin with. And I've been thinking, well, maybe because Merz has worked in the United States and he worked for BlackRock, this big investment fund, and he's used to dealing with characters like Trump, although is there really any other character like Trump? Maybe not. That he might be the one who can renew Europe's relationship with the United States, but that might be wishful thinking on my part, and it's not looking good. Tonight he was taking a much more negative tone, talking about alternatives to NATO and sort of discussing whether it would be necessary to have a stronger European defense pillar, which it certainly would be, but this isn't the kind of thing that you can achieve overnight or even over a few years.
Or at all at this point, given
the budget
situation.
constraints.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, will this be better for Europe in the end, this new coalition, or or worse? Will it just be more stasis, more uncertainty on the European front, and no real clarity in terms of where's the momentum going to come from? Will there be momentum coming from Berlin on European issues? I don't really see it at the moment.
I find it so ironic because, again, as I said earlier, all of a sudden the future German chancellor and the French president, they sound as similar as they haven't sounded in years. Sounded being perhaps an overstatement because you never heard anything coming from Olaf Scholz other than, thank you, Manuel, great ideas for Europe. But, that really didn't help anything. They are singing from the same hymn sheet now, if you listen to Merz tonight, to an extent mostly on security policies, to an extent possibly on economic policy, especially if he's joining forces with the Greens, who are really on the French line now when it comes to economic and industrial policy. They are French, basically. So ironically, I think the Franco-German engine might be more aligned than ever. So in that sense, it's a positive for Europe. But at this point, again, it goes back to the question, will they have the means to get there? And it is on one side too early to say. We don't even have the full result yet of the German election, but I'm cautiously pessimistic. I am having a feeling like we will see a German government that might be chained by the constitutional constraints that it seems to be facing. One thing I would add, though, is if you have listened closely to the chat shows today that were on television, and you've listened to Merz, Robert Habeck, and Olaf Scholz, you could gain a sense that everyone was aware of the seriousness of the situation, and everyone seemed to be very ready to make compromises. And perhaps this sort of like really difficult situation we're in right now releases a new dynamic for the center that sort of like pulls together and finds a compromise. And we might just hope that this is what happens.
Well, I think that's a good optimistic note to end on. We'll be covering this story, of course, intensely in the coming days and weeks. Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you
for joining me, and we'll speak to you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.
That was all from Berlin. This is still a developing story, so check out Euractiv's latest coverage to follow the outcome of the elections.
As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.